My oldest son is a contractor, and he was working a job, and it was at a really tight deadline, and he had to finish tiling a kitchen floor. And so I came in from work, and I was like, "Where is everybody?" My wife was like, "Well, Caleb called, and three of my other children went to help him." Well, what's interesting is that they're not contractors, right? And I was like, "How cool is it to be able to call in some reinforcements, pick up the phone, have three of your siblings just show up on an instant notice, and then do it?" But the three siblings came back, and they just had the best time. They'd never tiled a floor before, but like, "Yeah, Caleb taught us in about 20 minutes. We were going full steam, and when the guy came in, we were all like spread out across this kitchen floor getting it done." And then my daughter goes, "And it looked really nice." And I thought, that connection to fulfillment is understanding the purpose. And when you look at this and say, this work is kingdom work, you want to become an adult because it allows you to accept full responsibility doing the work that you're called to do. And that work matters in terms of not just who you impact here immediately, but it matters on an eternal scale. That really does change everything.
Hello, and welcome back to the Be Unbound podcast. I'm your co-host, David Rethemeyer.
And I'm your co-host, Jonathan Brush.
And we are back into our series on adult. And if you are joining us for the first time, this is a series of 5 different episodes where we are breaking down the adult model that Unbound uses, partially as a framework for how we go about our education and training young adults, but also just is a framework that we find helpful to apply in a lot of different areas. And so today we get to sit down for a conversation about the 4th in that model, which is live.
And we get to have a guest back to the show who for us isn't so much as guest as almost family. Riley Moss will be joining us in the studio. Riley is the epitome of some of this things we talk about in terms of living and the adult model, and has some great things to say. And it's just always fun to hang out with her. And so we're looking forward to that conversation. We hope you enjoyed as much as we did. Riley Moss, welcome back to the Be Unbound podcast. David and I have the privilege of talking to you pretty much every day, but our audience doesn't have the opportunity to talk to you so much. And we're glad to bring you back and put you in front of our audience, especially as we continue the adult learning framework that we use at Unbound and suggest to you is just a helpful way to sort of take a look at life and education. Adult stands for ask, do, understand, live, and thrive. And we've got ask, do, and understand before. And so today we're talking about the live part of that, and happy to have Riley with us to help us discuss what it's like to live a full and satisfying life, which I can say from my experience, Riley's doing a pretty good job doing.
Well, it's definitely full. That is for sure. I think, honestly, the rest of the team might have a little bit to do with that. We come up with projects just about as fast as we execute them on, but it's a pretty fun process to be a part of. So, and hopefully satisfying. If you can sit down at the end of the day and look back on all the fun projects, I'd say we're 10 out of 10 for those right now. So it's a busy season, but a really good one. So looking forward to this conversation with you guys today.
Well, let's talk a little bit about what we mean by live. So we've talked before about, the first 3 are a little bit out of order. We say, really you have to ask good questions. We talk about having a questions-based paradigm in order to understand, and frame to understand in a couple of different ways. The one that I kind of like the most is to understand the game that's actually being played. And the theory there is that there's often something a little underneath the surface. There's a little bit behind the scenes that's going on, that if you understand how that's going, then you get a better understanding of what's happening in life. But that to do either of those things requires some piece of action. You have to ask a question, you have to take a bit of action on the answer that you get. To understand, you have to act on understanding, even just to test the hypothesis. But then the result of that is that you live, right? I mean, you're doing this for a reason. And so what does it mean to live a full life? Now, we would say to live a full life is more just to survive, but to thrive. And we'll talk about thrive in our next episode. But in this case, it comes back to the acronym itself, adult. We work with young adults, and we work in an interesting time and culture where there's a resistance to moving from adolescence into adulthood. And I joke with my own family that I've never met a teenager. I refuse to accept teenagers. And what I mean by that is that, in my opinion, there's children who have a dependency on somebody else. There are young adults who are beginning to gain responsibility. And then there are full adults, people who have accepted responsibility for their life. And so in the Unbound framework here that we use, to live is to be an adult, to accept full responsibility for your life. So David or Riley, maybe you're a little closer to this transition than I am just by birth dates here. So what did that look like for you to accept full responsibility for your life?
Yeah, that's a really good distinction. I love the idea of no teenagers. I don't know that I've heard you say it exactly like that before, but I really like that concept of this being more of a increased responsibility level and even just an awareness of that responsibility at the same time. That's something I'm really, really thankful that my mom in particular kind of instilled in us and giving us choices from a young age that were very low impact, but helped us to build that responsibility skill set very, very early on. And then taking that as we got older. And now it's not only her putting things in front of us to say, hey, you're responsible for this, or hey, you need to figure out what this kind of looks like in your life, but fostering kind of that skill set and that muscle of saying, oh, actually, I didn't even need her to poke me on that. This is something that I'm thinking about as a young adult. I'm intrigued by this. I want to explore this. I want to, take this step or try this thing. And the more you build that muscle, the more it becomes kind of your reflex, I guess. And so as an adult, I feel like that reflex should be pretty well developed in the right direction to be able to say, okay, what exactly is the situation that I'm in? What, inputs am I getting? And what outputs am I then deciding to kind of execute on? I don't know. So that's kind of a good framework, I feel like, to kind of jump into the discussion with.
Yeah, I think looking at that is really helpful. I think I can share that experience in that there was just a lot of like building on that early, and then that my parents facilitated, and then just looking for ways to then execute that on that as adults. I think it's been interesting for me looking at some of the other members of my generation and how they view responsibility just as a reality of life, and just how negative of a view of responsibility there is. And that's just really, really discouraging. And I think at least from my perspective, I understand at least some of where it comes from, because has been a little bit of this pushback from you have to do every single thing that comes your way. You have to be like this exact model of what an adult should be. And I think that there's some amount of pushback that I think I can understand from that. But based on what I've seen, I think it's just been kind of come to just, well, responsibility in and of itself is just something that should generally be avoided, aside from just like the bare minimum. And then everything else in your life should revolve around how can I just make life more enjoyable and like bring about the kind of life that I am going to enjoy the most. And most people equate that to a reduction in responsibility, just because there is just naturally a lot of pressure and a lot of just like things that you have to manage. You have to be keeping a lot of things in mind. You have to keep track of your responsibilities. You have to be able to balance when you have multiple different responsibilities that sometimes compete with each other. It takes more work. And just because there is just an association of more work means less fun, therefore we should avoid it, I feel like I've just seen a responsibility and taking responsibility for more things be viewed more and more unfavorably. I don't know if you guys have seen that.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that, as we talk about this part of the framework, the idea here is that, if you can train somebody to ask good questions, and you can train them to understand what's actually going on, then you train them to actions. They do things. That is how you train an adult. And to live is to live as an adult, which is to accept full responsibility for your life, to be able to move into that position where you're an independent agent. And when I say independent, I mean this in a faith context. We're never independent from God, but that we're growing into, maybe a better way to say this then is that we're growing into what God, created us to be. And that when we grow into that, we're able to be an agent for the kingdom. We're able to do God's work. We're able to serve him in some unique fashion. That's not to say that children don't serve God. It doesn't mean that young adults don't serve God, but it means that you have more and more responsibility to do that. But I'd like to kind of focus that part of the conversation, because David, I think you said something really important. We're seeing in so many ways an epidemic of irresponsibility, which is not so much that people are irresponsible as that they flee from responsibility. They're not interested in it. And I think that's a curious thing. And I also think it's a somewhat recent phenomenon. I don't know that it's not that it never existed in any other times in history, but if you go back, say, to the colonial period, you have men wearing powdered wigs because it makes them look older and therefore more sophisticated. There was a desire to add age in order to increase your social status. Now, of course, we're at the other end. There's a desire to reduce age to increase your social status. Even if you go back a generation or two, it was the desire for young adults, for adolescents, to become adults. You wanted to grow up and be, whatever it is that you were doing next. You wanted to move into your own independent type of living situation. And so the reversal of that is somewhat odd, especially since when we talk about responsibility, I think, David, you made several good points, but some of it was, there's these things to be responsible for. There is, but there isn't. I mean, on one end, there are things to be responsible for, but the lack of responsibility doesn't have the consequences. A generation or so back, if you were irresponsible, you might have starved to death or lost your house or not been unable to provide for your family. Those are not the most pertinent threats for most people, at least living in the West. That's not true on a global scale, right? Because I think to live is some part of this is to accept responsibility. And that is a strange countercultural message right now for reasons that are a little unclear.
Yeah, that's a good clarification. I think launching off of what David had said, I do think that some of that is tied to this cultural shift into responsibility equals not fun, and we have a very fun driven culture and really an ease and a, pleasure focused culture rather than a results, not results in a bad way, but a results in hey, this is what hard work will look like, or this is what the satisfaction of completing a project will bring to your life, or getting to stick with something long enough to actually see the other side of it. I think Trent has come on here multiple times and talked about resiliency and grit and how do you hold in there for the long game. And I don't think that our young adults I don't think they're being trained to think about the long game. They're thinking about what is immediately gratifying, what is immediately going to give me, that boost of dopamine or whatever it is. I think social media probably contributes a lot to this, where we have kind of that instant gratification and that instant, reaction. We see bad things instantly and they feel overwhelming instantly. Maybe we need to give people a little bit of credit on that side too. I think the world can seem more overwhelming potentially to a young adult today than it did 50 years ago, only because you have access to see all of the potential things in front of you immediately. And to be fair, that's kind of overwhelming. And so I think that takes some wisdom in how are you consuming the amount of, how are you consuming the amount of information that's coming at you, and process that in a way that doesn't leave you with despair, but helps motivate you to see it through the lens of hope. To say, wow, yeah, this is a lot of things in my world that are shifting and growing or feel unstable, but yet that doesn't cause me to reverse and back away from it. But how do I actually lean into that? So I don't know, that might just be playing devil's advocate a little bit in maybe thinking through what are some of the factors that also help drive people to lean into that. Well, if it's not fun immediately and it feels really overwhelming immediately, then that leaves me in a position of not wanting to adult very well in this particular moment. So I don't know. What do you guys think about that?
I think that kind of fun factor is a really important piece of this equation and a piece of this. And Riley, you and I had an interesting conversation recently, and we also just had an interesting experience together. So we just recently celebrated a milestone for Unbound, and we had a company dinner. And I stumbled on that day in preparation, as I was preparing some remarks for that, I stumbled on a video of, I think it's, and audience, you have to forgive me, I stumbled on the video of a famous athlete, but it was a golf athlete who I absolutely are saying athletes. I just don't follow golf, so I didn't know him. So it's Scotty Scheffler or something like that. And when I said it, half the room was like, of course, he's the most famous golfer right now. So I apologize to anybody who's a golf fan. I wasn't trying to disparage the man. I just don't follow golf. But he had this really interesting press conference, and we watched it in its entirety. It was about 5 minutes long. And in it, he's struggling out loud in a media interview, basically saying, I've fulfilled all my dreams. I'm playing this game at a high level, at an extremely high level. I'm winning all these tournaments. I'm really good at it. And yet when I win a tournament, the feeling is so fleeting. It lasts for such a short amount of time. It just vanishes. And you could hear him saying, I don't know why I'm doing this. I don't know what the purpose of this. And he kind of says, I guess that sounds strange. And then they must have thought, because he says, yeah, it's like obviously the audience feedback he got was everybody's looking at him what does the matter with you? You're on the top of your game. Everybody wants to be you. But I thought that was really interesting. Here's a man who has achieved our generation's, or this generation's, and many generations that matters, epitome, right? You get paid a lot of money, more than most of us can imagine, to play a game. And he's really struggling and going, I don't know what the point of this is. Now, Riley, that juxtaposed with an interesting conversation that you and I had, where in addition to having a milestone of the company, this has been a really frantic pace for Unbound recently. And all of us on this call have been working like crazy. Riley, maybe more than most. And we had this kind of brief moment where we said, on one hand, this is not fun. Like we don't, it's been days since we had a day off. We don't know what weekends are anymore. Nobody can remember it was Monday because we've just been working constantly. And yet at the same time, there is something deeply satisfying about working like this and seeing things get done. And if we're honest with ourselves, we're far more miserable at those times when everything seems to be going well and we're not sure what to do next. I think that that's a reality that I've seen, and yet that's not a reality that most people perceive, which makes it fall into that thing of, do you understand this? So any feedback on that? And David, I can see that you're kind of boiling to answer that, so go for it, man.
Yeah. I think that there's a lot of threads here that I think are really interesting. I think one that's been hit on in multiple answers is just the fact that like it is a longer term thing. It requires a bit more long term just vision and seeing that no, what I am doing maybe in this specific moment in time right now is not the most enjoyable thing, but I know that it is getting me to a place where it is accomplishing something that is really worthwhile and that I really do want to make happen and that I really do value and appreciate. And I think, too, that a thread that we've had really through this entire series that we've had on the adult model is purpose. And just how important knowing the purpose of your life and knowing the purpose of what you are doing and what the tasks day in and day out that you're involved in is so important. And I think it just helps us to have the context of why should we go and do something that's really hard? Why should we be, working 60-hour work weeks and just, losing out on other opportunities that in those moments would be more fun? It's because we know the purpose of why we are working those 60-hour work weeks. We know that it is sure, like not as fun in the moment, but we know it's because we are accomplishing something that is valuable. We are working towards a result that we know is going to change lives literally and impact young people in a positive way. And ultimately, we all know that it's because this is where God has put each and every one of us in this particular moment in time, and we are glorifying Him by serving as faithfully as we can in this place where He has us. And so to give our all to do that, especially when we have that right heart attitude, is something that doesn't necessarily bring us that momentary dopamine hit of happiness, but I think is where you end up getting that fulfilled feeling of knowing that you are accomplishing your purpose. And so that's why you can have those moments of, yeah, on the one hand, this is not necessarily the most fun, but it is fulfilling. And I think that's something that is very rarely found in most people today.
That's a great distinction, to look at things as being fulfilling rather than fun, because fun is short term and fulfilling is long term. Kind of a little bit of a joy versus happiness, I feel like, angle there. I think something else that you said made me think about a really key element to all of this is all of these pieces within the context of community. You have to have community for all of these pieces to work well, because those 60-hour work weeks are going to get really, really frustrating if you are not surrounded by people who are either A, in the trenches with you, doing it alongside you, which hopefully you have. And in our case, we absolutely do. This has been something that we're leaning on each other as a team, and we're encouraging each other in the ebbs and the flows to say, yeah, you can do one more thing here. Like we're pushing to, like, let's go, let's do this as a team. But it's also the people who are outside of your close circle and might just be watching you go through this hard thing, and they have no idea what you're doing. They have no context for it. They're not doing it with you, but they are coming alongside you and saying, hey, I made an extra serving of dinner so that you didn't have to do that. I noticed you've been working really late, and so I went ahead and just swapped out your laundry for you. Or, hey, you've been really quiet lately. Just wanted to check in, make sure you're doing all right. I think all of these things are really going to look different based on the communities that you're in, but having those people around you who not only understand the goal and what that long-term target is, but who are dedicated to walking alongside you in those things is going to make a really big difference in how you can actually live out your day-to-day life with those people kind of by your side. And that makes all the difference in the world. And I don't know whether that means we just have a major community problem right now in our country, which I think we quite possibly do. And trying to figure out, how do you foster that level of community? How do you build those types of relationships? How do you gain that level of trust with another person to even recognize that they're walking through a hard season? And so I think that's something that is an interesting thing to poke at a little bit as maybe a reason why people struggle to kind of pull those dots all together, I guess.
I think that, was it, David, did you say it was fulfilling versus fun? I think we talk about, when we create course content, we want our courses to be engaging, not entertaining. Our job is not to entertain you, but our job is certainly to engage you, to make it relevant. And so I think that's the same kind of quote, fulfilling versus fun. I had an interesting example of this last night as we were thinking about this, and Riley, in the context of community. My oldest son is a contractor, and he was working a job, and it had a really tight deadline, and he had to finish tiling a kitchen floor. And about mid-afternoon, his coworker got sick, which required him to leave and the other coworker to take him. So a job that's requiring 3 people all of a sudden was down to 1 person, but the deadline hadn't changed. And so I came in from work, and I was like, where is everybody? And my wife was like, well, Caleb called, and 3 of my other children went to help him. Well, what's interesting is that they're not contractors, right? And so the 3 of them went to help finish this tiling job. And when they came back later, I said, how'd it go? And they were just bubbling, and they had the most fun. First of all, the homeowner comes in and he finds, an entire family tiling the kitchen floor, and he's like, what is going on? And my oldest son just grinned, and he said, we need to call in some reinforcements. And I was like, how cool is it to be able to call in some reinforcements, pick up the phone, and have 3 of your siblings just show up on an instant notice and then do it? But the 3 siblings came back, and they just had the best time. They'd never tiled a floor before, but like, yeah, Caleb taught us in about 20 minutes. We were going full steam. And when the guy came in, we were all like spread out across this kitchen floor getting it done. And then my daughter goes, and it looked really nice. And I thought, there are fun things you can do together. We've done fun things together as a family, right? I mean, we could go to the movies. We could, we could stay at home and watch something. We could have played a game or something like that. But none of that would have had the deep kind of rich satisfaction that the 4 of them had, kind of coming in grinning, honestly, with a little bit of a swagger. Here was a big serious thing happening that we weren't sure that we were going to be able to do, and then we did it, and it's done, and it was on time. And so I think there's just some, there's that fulfillment part. And, if we kind of are thinking about this in terms of what we want people to know, it's that connection to fulfillment is something that David tagged onto earlier, I think, and Riley mentioned as well, which is understanding the purpose. And when you look at this and say, this work is kingdom work, you want to become an adult because it allows you to accept full responsibility of doing the work that you're called to do. And that work matters in terms of not just who you impact here immediately, but it matters on an eternal scale. That really does change everything.
I totally agree. I can absolutely picture any of your children coming home with that being the case. I think that's a really fun example. And honestly, it reminds me of something that we did a lot as a family growing up. We were kind of known as the family at church that would show up when somebody needed to be moved in or packed up and moved out. And it was like, oh, here are the Mosses, and Caleb's like, I don't know, 3, 4, like he's not all that old. And I distinctly remember showing up to one family's house when we were unloading in this case and kind of getting everything off the trailer and into the house. And I remember kind of seeing the look on her face of like, oh, great. Like there's going to be kids underfoot. This is going to make things, 3 times as long. This is going to be such a pain. And I remember afterwards, she came up to Mom and she was like, I cannot believe how much faster we got everything done, like with your kids here. And, Caleb just, schlepping boxes back and forth as fast as his little 3-year-old legs can carry him. And, it was more about what are the lessons that we're learning right now? What's the foundation that we're building? How are we looking at this thing that most people would kind of label as work? And those are highlight memories for me. I can remember almost every house that we moved people in and out of as a family. And those are really sweet memories to look back on. But I also think that they were very foundational in shaping the way that we looked at, completing work either individually as a family for that purpose. Like you talked about, David, we can see that this is a new church member and we're welcoming them in. They probably don't know anybody at the church yet because they're brand new. And so it was always just this community day, and we had one gal and she would always bring the same kind of cookies, and you only got those kind of cookies if you showed up on moving day. So, like there's just these really fun elements that you build this level of community and familiarity around these projects that a lot of people would look at and go, that's a lot of responsibility. That's a lot of work. That doesn't sound very fun. Well, maybe not in the moment when you're sweating, trying to get the sofa up the stairs, but it is deeply fulfilling. And I think that's the difference that you kind of have to look for and to train into people from a young age. I really do think that starting that young is the best possible way to go. So, and now I know who to call if my floors need rechild. So this is great. I'm learning things.
Yeah, apparently we have a whole crew. I did have some pointed questions about whether they would do our kitchen next, and that didn't seem to have quite the same excitement about it. But Riley, to that point, I think that we have a fun memory of all kinds of things we've done as a community here locally. But one of the ones that we come back to a lot and we get excited about is that there was a day when somebody had scored a free piano. It was a large upright piano. It needed to move to an upstairs apartment, and I remember Riley saying, "I will be there in 20 minutes with the brownies." And in about 40 minutes, we had assembled like 35 people. Riley showed up with the brownies, and we carried this piano up these steps into this apartment. And, we've done a lot of fun things, but if you ask about a story that we all like to share, it's that day that we moved the piano. And it was work, but it was, to our point here, fulfilling work. And I think that's something to think about in this whole idea of responsibility. To live as adults, to be fully responsible. And that means doing the fulfilling work and finding fulfillment in that work. And there's a significant, when those things get attached, when you see work as something as fulfilling, it ends up surpassing the fun, and it also happens to lead to responsibility, which, is what being an adult is all about.
Yeah, I think there is a worthwhile caveat here to make, is that we're not saying that it is just a bad thing to just occasionally do something that is just fun just for the sake of its own enjoyment. I don't think any of us are meaning that. I just think that it's worth saying here is that it's completely viable to just take some time and just go do something that is enjoyable. I think just the caveat is that just because something that is enjoyable, like I could go and, just read a fantasy novel that I enjoy, and that is enjoyable, and I think to some extent, that can be helpful for me because it allows me to decompress a little bit from the day and helps me to just kind of get into a different headspace that I can, allow me to be a better friend to some people, or it can inspire creativity in my brain. And so there's a lot of things that you can gain from those things. But I think it's very, very easy, especially in a day and age where instant gratification is more and more celebrated, to say, yes, that is fun in the moment, but that doesn't mean that should be the entirety of what you were pursuing. Just because it is fun in that moment does not mean that should what all of your moments should look like. And there are other things that are worth doing, just like the examples that you guys just talked about that are excellent, that are not as enjoyable in that specific moment, but end up bringing much more fulfillment as a whole. And so I think it's just worth throwing in that note of there's a little bit of balance required here too, of saying, is it a bad thing for you to go and just take a walk, listen to some music, play a game, ride a bike, read a book? Not at all. Not at all. But just as long as that's not taking the place of those other things that are actually going to bring that fulfillment.
That's a really important caveat to throw in there. And one that I think we might be able to tuck under the umbrella of learning how to live is it's a very fine line between figuring out where is your balance between resting and working responsibly, and kind of using those two things to go hand in hand with each other, because you can't be a responsible, worker. You can't be a responsible adult. You can't be a healthy adult unless you're also taking responsibility for the ways that you're resting and the ways that you're resetting and the ways that you're stepping back from the moments that are really stressful or that kind of push you to the edge of your limits. And I think that if we fail to be responsible in that area of our life, we can actually do more long-term damage, either to ourselves, to our relationships, to our health. There's kind of a myriad of things that are probably going to begin to suffer if we're not also balancing out, okay, where am I working responsibly and where am I also resting responsibly? And so I love that. I love that caveat. And I 100% agree that is also part of being an adult, is learning how to rest well. And I know that for me, that's something that I actively have to continue learning, because sometimes I would rather just be doing and completing and checking things off of a list. And so resting, I think for some people could be actually a little bit harder to stop and think about and say, okay, I know I need this, but what are the best ways for me to do that in this season? So that's a really important thing to throw in there. Thanks for pulling that out a little bit.
I was just going to say I'm inspired. I think that I should stop doing podcasts and go take a walk. So I don't know. Maybe we should end that conversation
Might be
there.
on to
I'll
something.
take a little bit of a break and go for a walk and take a rest. I don't know. Maybe we should read a book or something, David. It sounds like you were in the middle of a good one. I heard you were kind of specific in the genre there that you might have been working on. So
Mr. Sanderson may or may not have me in the middle of a pretty good one at the moment.
Well, thanks for coming along for this conversation, Riley. It's always a pleasure to have you on the show and always a pleasure to learn from you. I will attest that Riley is certainly the epitome of responsibility, as is David, but I will also attest that at least once a week, typically on a Thursday nights, there's a whole crowd of us that get together, and I get to see both Riley and David having fun, and I get to participate in that as well. So don't get the wrong impression about a no fun group here. There is a lot of responsibility. There is a lot of fulfillment. There's also a lot of fun. And to Riley's point there at the end and David's point at the end, I think that's something to kind of note here as well, that fun becomes more fun post-fulfillment. And I don't want to take this too deep, too far here, but I will just tell you that, if you've ever spent a day watching some sort of show or just, zoning out or something, and just had that feeling of kind of wasted, worthless time, versus if you've ever sat down with a good book after a day of hard work, or even collapsed into a chair on a Friday night and watched a movie after you've given everything you had for work, there's a difference between those two. And so in so many ways, fun is enriched by doing the fulfillment first.
Absolutely. Could not agree more.
Well, with that, thanks very much for joining us, Riley. Thanks for those of you who are listening. And as we continue our journey through here, Ask, Do, Understand, and Live, we do say it's not just to live, it's not just to survive, but to thrive. And we'll be talking about that on our very next episode. Well, David, I would say that conversation was fulfilling, and we might even go so far as to say it might even have been a little bit fun. And I don't honestly know that I've spent any time with Riley that didn't translate to fun at some point.
And listen, because we get to say that this is part of our jobs, we are being responsible right now by doing this. We get to be responsible by having fun conversations. This is awesome.
This is like my friend who owns a farm and expenses rifles. He's like, it's varmint control. And so he writes them off as a business expense. So having a fun conversation with Riley and calling it work seems a little bit, I don't know, indulgent, but it is indeed the case. And so it was fun talking to Riley, but there is some serious topics here. Not serious in the fact that we want to sober you up, but serious in the fact that I think there's an entire generation of people who have a misguided idea of what it means to be responsible. And because of that, flee from it, and in doing so, miss the chance for real fulfillment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There is so much to be gained potentially from having this viewpoint shifted. And I think Riley brought in an excellent point in talking about community too, is that when you have a community of people who are challenging you and pushing you and encouraging you to embrace that alongside of them, and you all get to do it together, that just makes it the most fun and the most fulfilling at the same time. It can be both.
And something we didn't mention, something to think about, is that if you're a young adult, if you're a parent listening to this, or if you're a young adult and this applies to you, one of the easiest ways to lean into this whole responsibility thing is to surround yourself with people who care about that. And so that might be a challenge. Our challenge to you is to find a peer group that practices responsibility and is a little more interested in fulfillment than fun. And of course, if that makes sense to you and you're interested in that, then we would challenge you to go to beunbound.us, where you can find programs ranging from high school to post-high school that are indeed populated with a bunch of people who tend to be ultra responsible, who tend to really focus on the fulfillment aspect. And we can attest are a lot of fun to hang out with. In fact, in just a few weeks, we're going to be hanging out with them at our premier flagship event, which is Apex, our national conference. And we can tell you that is full of responsible people. It's very fulfilling work, but it is an awful lot of fun. So we're looking forward to that. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for joining us with the conversation with Riley. I hope that we moved your thinking a little bit in terms of responsibility and fun and all those kinds of things, what it means to be an adult. And until next time, be unbound.